Meu nome é Esly Carvalho e eu sou presidente da EMDR Treinamento e Consultoria. E mesmo de longe nós apoiamos o Janeiro Branco, uma iniciativa, uma campanha importante da psicoeducação da saúde mental. A nossa contribuição vai ser uma série de vídeos com entrevistas de profissionais ao redor do mundo, enfatizando e nos informando sobre a importância da saúde mental. A seguir você vai ver mais uma dessas entrevistas. Tudo de bom, Janeiro Branco.
Hi, my name is Rolf Carriere. I have been working with the United Nations from the early 70s until the early years of the year 2000. And I was working mostly with UNICEF for the benefit of children in countries like India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burma. And somewhere halfway into my career, I began to wonder whether we were actually doing enough as an organization, UNICEF at that time, about mental health of children. We were working on water, sanitation, education, other health issues, physical health issues, but mental health, it seemed to me, was not getting its due share. And when I was posted in Bangladesh particularly, I realized that perhaps as much as half the population, if not more, of that country was traumatized one way or the other. So I very soon focused on the issue of trauma. I realized that mental health is much more than trauma or the other 7 or 8 mental health conditions that the World Health has recognized. But it seemed to me that for trauma, we had some approaches that actually could go to scale. And I've always been keen to find ways to take technologies that work on a smaller scale to take them to a larger scale, to a global scale. That's why I like very much working with both UNICEF and the World Bank. World Bank always had the funding to take things to a very large scale. So why is trauma, let me focus on trauma, important? First of all, I think that the world hasn't properly recognized how big the problem is. The prevalence of trauma, and let's take PTSD as the short version of that. There are about 500 million people in the world living with PTSD. They suffer from trauma and its adverse consequences, and those adverse consequences include, of course, things like productivity loss, impaired relationships, impaired health. That's at the individual level. At the community level and at the national level, we should also take into account what it does to national productivity, economic growth, but also violence, because we know that there is an intergenerational transmission of trauma, abuse, and violence. And unfortunately, the world, including the United Nations, has not adequately recognized the importance of this. So even though we have now the global sustainable development goals for 2030, mental health had only a very feeble reference in that document, and unfortunately trauma itself is not even mentioned, whereas things like polio eradication and AIDS and so on, they are mentioned. So I think the time is long past due that the world mental health professionals stand up and demand that much more be done about trauma care in the world. To my mind, it is possible to scale up trauma care now, particularly with the discovery of EMDR, of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And recently we had a meeting in Boston where the early interventions were showcased and how that allows us already to work much more in groups. So we move perhaps from the individual therapy to group therapy. We begin to move from professionals who do this kind of work to include also paraprofessionals or other professions like doctors, nurses, educationists, clergy, all of whom are professionals in their own right, but who are frontline workers often. They are present, locally present, when there is a natural disaster, when there is endemic violence, etc. And so if they had more skills, and in this case, AIP-based skills, adaptive information processing skills, which is EMDR-based, then they could be on-site, able to handle much of the early phases of trauma, and perhaps even prevent PTSD from setting in altogether. So having a kind of a preventive aspect. I think that these kind of people, but also organizations like Rotary, Kiwanis, the World Scout movement, the Red Cross, obviously, these are all large-scale institutions already having their staffs in these countries, already having people on the ground. So if we could reach them with carefully designed curricula and training that includes also the use of online training. It's if you want to go to scale, one of the opportunities you have is the communications revolution in the world, as well as the skills revolution in the world. There are so many more people now than 50 years ago when I started my work in the UN, available to take on these kind of tasks. So the communications revolution and the skills revolution, plus the appropriate technology, mental health technology and trauma care technology that we now have, together allow us to do much more and begin to work on this very large global burden of trauma that the world sees. That requires that we make a big shift from the global north to include the global south. There is insufficient attention in Africa, in Asia, less perhaps in Latin America. You're much further advanced, but and we need to move also another shift from the small T traumas to the big T traumas. We need to be present with our own skills and professionalism to create paraprofessional capacities in countries that suffer violence, endemic violence, and natural disasters. And I already mentioned we should also move another shift from individual therapy to include group therapy. Start more with group therapy in those countries. These are the elements that will help us to scale up. So mental health is no longer to be seen as a private mental health issue, but as a public mental health issue at the global scale. And I hope that organizations like UNICEF and the High Commission for Refugees, the World Health Organization, the Organization for Migration, there are many organizations that actually want to have these skills that I'm talking about that are EMDR based. We organized just recently an expert workshop to create these paraprofessional trauma care curricula, and we had several people from the UN present also, someone from UNHCR, someone from UNICEF, from the big organization Action contre la faim. So more and more, I think, and I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised by that, there is now a demand from those organizations that they see there is a recognition that this is long overdue, and the World Health Organization on the CBT side has already rolled out a program called Low Intensity Interventions, which is good. But I think that there is an inherent superiority that EMDR-based methods have, because it can be done on consecutive days or even intensively on one day, unlike the CBT approaches that need to have at least a week in between. You don't need to do homework, which is another inhibitor when it comes to scaling up globally. You can do it blind to therapists. It's no longer needed for you to spell out the whole story. And of course, in group therapy, you shouldn't be talking, you shouldn't have in the group people talking about their particular traumatic experience, because they may actually trigger other people. So this blind to therapy, this people who don't want to talk about rape or whatever awful things have happened to them, they can come to this AIP-based therapy and don't have to expose themselves, and thereby potentially also traumatizing others or even their therapists. Okay, so there's also a fact that is not well recognized. That's the importance of trauma. A lot of history, a lot of the things that have happened in history, the bad things that have happened in history, may actually have trauma as a cause. So trauma, PTSD on a large scale that people experienced may actually explain why things have been going so bad in the world. And just to bring it to the present day, the UN has three principal pillars. One is to create prosperity, the development pillar, to ensure peace, and to ensure human rights, to honor and promote human rights. Now, trauma undermines all three of these pillars. Trauma undermines the prosperity pillar because people's productivity goes down, people's effectiveness goes down, and so as a result, their income goes down. They need to spend a lot of money on poor health. So that is one important factor that keeps the development at a lower level than it could be if there were no trauma. The second pillar is peace, and we know that the intergenerational transmission of trauma, violence, and abuse is a fact. I mean, it has been so well established. Look at Northern Ireland, which has the highest recorded prevalence of PTSD, and at 27%, if I'm not mistaken. And this is the result of centuries of fights between your two religious communities. And in a way, it is what in the Bible is talked about in this, up until the seventh generation of those who hate me, will be seeing the negative consequences. I think this is a beautiful example of that. And then thirdly, the human rights are badly affected by people who are mentally harmed and who are suffering from mental health problems, including trauma. There's a lot of stigma attached to trauma and other mental health conditions, and the way that people with mental health issues are often treated is just not acceptable and not in line with the human rights tenets. So trauma and mental health issues are hugely important and should actually have been given a much higher priority within the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And I hope that now that people begin to see that it is possible to deal with this, that it will be undertaken by the UN, but before that by professionals and others.